Yes, video 5 on violence, discrimination and neglect towards Tibetan children, a report submitted to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child on violations of the Convention on the Rights of the Child by the People's Republic of China against the children of Tibet. 4. Education, impediments to access and discriminatory content. A. The legal context, pertinent provisions of the CRC. The CRC provides in pertinent part, Article 2. States parties shall respect and ensure the rights set forth in the present convention to each child within their jurisdiction without discrimination of any kind, irrespective of the child's or his or her parents' or legal guardians' race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national, ethnic or social origin, property, disability, birth or other status. Article 28(1). States parties recognize the right of the child to education and with a view to achieving this right progressively and on the basis of equal opportunity, they shall in particular A. Make primary education compulsory and available free to all. B. Encourage the development of different forms of secondary education, including general and vocational education, make them available and accessible to every child and take appropriate measures such as the introduction of free education and offering financial assistance in case of need. C. Make higher education accessible to all on the basis of capacity by every appropriate means. D. Make educational and vocational information and guidance available and accessible to all children. C. Take measures to encourage regular attendance at schools and the reduction of dropout rates. Article 28(2). States parties shall take all appropriate measures to ensure that school discipline is administered in a manner consistent with the child's human dignity and in conformity with the CRC. Article 28(3). States parties shall promote and encourage international cooperation in matters relating to education, in particular with a view to contributing to the elimination of ignorance and illiteracy throughout the world and facilitating access to scientific and technical knowledge and modern teaching methods. In this regard, particular account shall be taken of the needs of developing countries. Article 29(1). States parties agree that the education of the child shall be directed to A. The development of the child's personality, talents and mental and physical abilities to their fullest potential. B. The development of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms and for the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. C. The development of respect for the child's parents, his or her own cultural identity, language and values, for the national values of the country in which the child is living, the country from which he or she may originate, and for civilizations different from his or her own. D. The preparation of the child for responsible life in a free society in the spirit of understanding, peace, tolerance, equality of the sexes, and friendship among all peoples, ethnic, national, and religious groups and persons of indigenous origin. E. The development of respect for the natural environment. Article 30. In those states in which ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities or persons of indigenous origin exist, a child belonging to such a minority or who is indigenous shall not be denied the right in community with other members of his or her group to enjoy his or her own culture, to profess and practice his or her own religion, or to use his or her own language. China violates those provisions. Primary schools charge fees which, in many cases, exceed the average per capita income of rural Tibetans. As a result, many Tibetan children do not attend school at all. The Special Rapporteur on the right of education to education in fact reported that illiteracy among Tibetan children is 39.5%. Some children must perform uncompensated physical labor in exchange for admission to primary school. Bribes and political connections often determine whether Tibetan children are admitted to primary and secondary schools, as well as whether, once they are admitted, they are actually taught. State-run schools are scarce in rural Tibet, where 80% of Tibetans live, and China has been closing some monastic affiliated and private schools that are the only alternatives. Tibetan children are not taught in Tibetan, are indoctrinated into Chinese communist ideology and not taught Tibetan history, and they are prohibited from manifesting their Tibetan cultural and religious identity. B. School fees. Although Chinese law prohibits primary schools from charging tuition or school fees, it permits them to charge miscellaneous fees, which effectively amount to the same thing. In practice, Tibetan children virtually always must pay fees to attend primary school. These include charges for admission, registration, desks, chairs, books, uniforms, fines for alleged misbehavior, and extra fees to augment their teachers' salaries. The fees range from 10 to 300 yuan per month, which with most children reporting fees of 100 to 200 yuan per month. Those are remarkable amounts given that, according to China's own official figures, the average per capita income in rural Tibet, both the Tar and Tibetan regions incorporated into neighboring Chinese provinces, ranges from 100 to 150 yuan per month. In some cases, poor Tibetan families that cannot afford the fees can still send their children to school, but the children must perform physical labor such as cleaning toilets as the price of admission. In other cases, however, the inability to afford the fees means that the children do not attend school at all. A young orphan from Kham did not attend school because the fees, which she believed to be 800 yuan per year plus 80 yuan for a uniform, were far more than she could afford. A young girl from Loka, where there are many primary schools, could not attend, nor could her 3 siblings, because their parents, poor farmers, could not afford the 2,000 yuan per year in fees plus the cost of books. A young nomad from western Tibet was unable to attend school until she was 12 years old, when her parents had finally saved enough money to pay the fees for her, but not for any of her several siblings. A young girl from Lhasa was the only one of her parents' 5 children to attend school, because her parents, a wood trader and a cloth seller could not afford the fees. To imposition of any fees for primary education, regardless of whether they are prohibitive or merely burdensome, violates China's obligation to make primary education compulsory and available free to all. Although an investigation by the Tar government in 1993 resulted in a central directive instructing country governments to cancel 6 so-called exorbitant fees, the practice apparently remains widespread. C. Bribes, political connections, and political opinions. Closely related to the fees charged for primary education are the necessities of paying bribes and or having political connections, guangxi, in order to obtain that education. The fees for primary education often vary, depending on whether the child possesses a Temto pass. Temto is a document or list in each local Chinese government office which authorities the listed person to live in that area, to attend school, to receive subsidized health care, and to obtain a job. It is difficult to get Temto for unauthorized children, those born in violation of family planning rules, but with bribes and or political connections, the necessary Temto pass can be acquired. A boy from Lhasa reported that the school fees were 500 yuan without a Temto pass, but only 300 yuan with it. The pass, however, cost 1,000 yuan and was difficult to obtain without government connections. Another boy from Lhasa reported that his family had to pay additional money beyond the 100 to 200 yuan of monthly fees to get him admitted to school without a Temto pass. Even when a Temto pass is not at issue, admission to primary school can still require political or other connections. For example, a boy from Kham could not attend a primary school because he said only students with influence in the Chinese government or relatives among the school staff would be admitted. Most of these students were Chinese, though Tibetan children whose parents worked for the Chinese government could also gain admission. Connections play a similar role in admission to secondary schools. A Tibetan girl who was listed first in her class at a primary school in Kham was told that she had been chosen as one of only 2 students to be sent to China for higher education. But when the next school year began, she discovered that the Chinese teacher's own child, whose grades were not comparable to hers, had been sent in her place. A Tibetan girl from Lhasa reported that a Chinese girl had taken her spot in secondary school because the Chinese girl's parents had connections within the Chinese government. Politics also plays a role in admission to secondary schools. For example, after a Chinese teacher told her that she had passed her exams, another Tibetan girl, the child of a family of poor farmers from the region of Nava, discovered that the official list neglected to include her name. She believes that authorities tampered with her grade because her mother is a former political prisoner. The practice of making admission to primary school dependent on bribes or political connections violates China's duty to make primary education compulsory and available free to all. The practice of making admission to secondary schools dependent on bribes or political connections violates China's duty to make secondary education available and accessible to every child. and the practice of making admission to any school dependent on a parent's politics violates China's duty to respect and ensure the rights set forth in the CRC to each child within its jurisdiction, irrespective of the child's or his or her parents' political or other opinion. Bribes in the form of money, other material goods, or uncompensated labor also often determine whether Tibetan students who have been admitted to primary school are actually taught, as well as whether they are mistreated. An 11-year-old girl from Lhasa reported that the quality of the teaching which students received depended on whether the students gave the teachers gifts, usually watches or money. She explained that each day her Chinese teacher would divide the class into students who did and those who did not give gifts. He taught the former group first. Only when they fully understood the lesson did he teach the later group. At times this meant that he did not teach them at all. A boy from Lhasa similarly told us that his teachers beat Tibetan students if their parents could not afford to give the teacher gifts. Chinese children in the same school, whose parents typically could afford gifts, received lenient treatment. Another Tibetan girl, who had initially been informed that she had passed her board exams, was later threatened with failure unless her father agreed to give the Chinese teacher 2 blankets as a bribe. At one girls' mixed primary school in Kham, the teacher forced Tibetan students to arrive early and stay late in order to clean the school and cook for the teachers. If they did not cooperate, she said teachers did not punish them physically, but refused to teach them. Another Tibetan girl from Lhasa said that she was forced to wash dishes and perform other uncompensated work for her Chinese teachers. Again, the practice of making whether a child is actually taught dependent on bribes of whatever form violates China's duty to make primary education compulsory and available free to all. And the practice of treating Tibetan and Chinese children differently violates China's obligation to respect and ensure the rights set forth in the CRC to each child within its jurisdiction, irrespective of the child's national, ethnic, or social origin. D. Lack of public education facilities in rural Tibet and the closure of private and monastic schools. Most state primary schools that receive significant funding from China's central government are located in urban regions, but more than 80% of Tibetans live in the rural regions of Tibet. Thus, many Tibetan children do not attend school at all, because the travel distances are too great. For example, an 11-year-old boy and his 4 siblings in Kham did not attend school because the closest one took over an hour to reach by truck. Similarly, another 11-year-old boy in Amdo did not attend school, in part because the nearest one was 2 days away by yak. In the urban areas, however, which are increasingly populated predominantly by Chinese settlers, the situation is rather different. At least as of the early 1990s, primary school enrollment in the Lhasa municipality stood of at roughly 70%, whereas primary school enrollment in rural Nagari was a mere 20%. Despite the manifest need for greater educational funding in rural Tibet, the Tar government has chosen to dissolve this burden to the impoverished local Tibetan residents. In addition to registration fees, supply costs, and payments to supplement teacher salaries, Tibetans must contribute to a system by which the funding of schools in rural areas depends directly on voluntary labor and the donation of materials by local people. The poorest Tibetan families often bear the greatest financial burden in providing their children with a basic primary education. In addition, China has been closing some of the monastic affiliated and private Tibetan schools that exist, even though they are often the only feasible alternatives to distant and poorly funded government educational facilities. For example, there used to be a boarding school in Loka, established and funded by a Tibetan Rinpoche. At one point, the school, which was open to all, provided instruction to more than 400 boarding students and 300 day students, teaching Chinese, Tibetan, mathematics, electrician skills, Tibetan medicine, and secretarial work. But Chinese authorities arrested the Rinpoche for alleged political activities and closed the school, leaving the children with no alternative for their education. 2 months later, many of the former students were arrested and interrogated under torture about what the Rinpoche had been teaching. At least one student, after her release from detention, was barred from attending any school at all for 3 years. A physician in a rural village in Amdo, concerned at the number of Tibetan children without access to primary education, established a small school to teach 1st through 3rd grades. He taught in Tibetan and charged no fees. But Chinese authority would not let him continue to operate the school unless he would teach China's political system and way of life and exclude Tibetan culture and tradition. In Naba Autonomous Prefecture in Amdo, the Kirti Monastery operated a school for some 500 students. It taught, among other subjects, Tibetan, mathematics, and poetry, and apart from math class, its teachers used Tibetan as the medium of instruction. But in 1998, Chinese authorities took over administration of the school. From then on, all lessons except Tibetan language had to be taught in Chinese. All students had to purchase and wear Chinese clothing instead of their traditional monastic robes, and all teachers had to participate in a re-education program focused on Chinese history and culture. According to the 2 teachers who described these events, the transformation of Kirti's primary school is only one example of a new rule that the Chinese authorities are now enforcing throughout Amdo. It forbids individually sponsored schools of any kind. This includes those sponsored by foreign charities and Tibetan Rinpoches, 2 major sources of private schools funding in Tibet. It is not clear whether Chinese authorities in the Tar or in the Chinese provinces that comprise Kham have instituted a similar rule. The prohibition of all individually sponsored schools violates the liberty of individuals and bodies to establish and direct educational institutions, and the practice of reducing rather than increasing educational opportunities for Tibetan children violates China's obligation to make primary education compulsory and available free to all. E. Pervasive anti-Tibetan discrimination, the language of instruction, the political and ideological curriculum, and the repression of Tibetan culture, history, and religious expression. In the state-run primary schools in Tibet, the prevailing medium of instruction is Chinese. That situation has long been documented. In 1988, rules were ensured by the Tar government concerning the study, usage and development of Tibetan language, and setting the principle of using both Tibetan and Chinese languages with Tibetan as the main language. Whether those rules were ever effectively implemented remains in dispute. In 1997, however, China officially shifted course and announced that Chinese would be the primary medium of instruction in all state-run schools, beginning in the first grade. That policy has largely been implemented, as demonstrated by the accounts of Tibetan children. One Tibetan boy in Lhasa was taught in Tibetan for the first 3 grades, after which Chinese became the language of instruction for all classes except Tibetan language. In 1996, however, the school began using Chinese as the primary language of instruction in all grades. Another boy in Lhasa reported that 4 times as much emphasis was placed on Chinese as on Tibetan at his primary school. Of the 8 class periods per day in which a girl from Kham participated, only 1 Tibetan language itself was taught in Tibetan. Academically, the Tibetan language appears to be regarded as an unimportant or futile subject. The reason for this is readily apparent. After the first 3 grades, most tests and all state board exams are administered in Chinese. Furthermore, advanced Chinese language skills appears to be a prerequisite for most good jobs in Tibet. As a result, Tibetans are becoming illiterate in their own language, but are actively encouraged to learn how to read and write Chinese. Let me say that it's some of the same thing that the Denmark did against the Greenland people, and they, in some way, they are criminal in that way. They destroyed their culture and their right to speak their own language, and tried, like China knew, to re-educate them in their picture. Beyond the core subjects taught in most primary schools, Chinese, Tibetan and mathematics, much of the curriculum aims to indoctrinate Tibetan children in China's version of socialism and in the idea that Tibet is an integral part of China. Several children, for example, reported being forced to pledge allegiance to the Chinese government. National pledges are not inherently objectionable, but international law emphasizes that children no less than adults must be permitted to exercise the right to freedom of speech. National pledges must be voluntary. In Tibet they are not. A boy from Amdo reported that Tibetan children who refused to pledge that Tibet is part of China were beaten, and a child from Kamdo reported that such children were denied food and embarrassed in front of their peers. Primary schools generally respect and celebrate Chinese holidays, but Tibetan holidays are ignored. and celebrating them is discouraged and even banned. Primary schools that teach Chinese history devote little attention to Tibet, but such mention as there is emphasizes only the alleged benevolence that China has shown to Tibet throughout history. The severest forms of ideological education occur in monasteries and nunneries, the only educational facilities available to some Tibetan children. A 15-year-old student described a test given on materials vilifying the Dalai Lama, which student had been forced by Chinese cadres to study. During the exams, the Chinese would surround us with guns and demand we answer the question, who is the destroyer of world peace? The right answer would be the Dalai Lama. The ideological education which Tibetan children receive goes hand in hand with the complete absence of any education about Tibetan history and culture. In most primary schools, there simply is no such education offered, and attempts to offer it, as well as the expressions of Tibetan cultural identity, especially Buddhism and respect for the Dalai Lama, are discouraged or punished. One boy from Lhasa learned nothing about Tibetan history other than the date of the building of the Potala. A boy from Kham, it was the palace where in Lhasa where Dalai Lama lived before he escaped in 1959. The Chinese have invited the Dalai Lama over to tea in their camp across the river, but Dalai Lama didn't go, and he escaped with his followers during the night. He escaped and he came to the West. If he had gone to tea with the Chinese, he had been dead, I guess. A boy from Kham reported that if students wore traditional Tibetan garb to school, they and their parents would be arrested. And a girl from central Tibet reported that she had been harassed by school authorities for doing so. In at least one primary school in Lhasa, teachers beat students for singing Tibetan songs. Many children reported that their schools prohibited all discussion of Tibetan religion and of the Dalai Lama, and even carrying photos of him would result in severe punishment. They've killed monks for having, or others for having, pictures in their homes on the breast of Dalai Lama. In one primary school in Amdo, attended exclusively by Tibetan children, a student was expelled for owning a copy of the Dalai Lama's autobiography. Pursuant to the CRC, the education of the child shall be directed to the development of respect for the child's own cultural identity, language, and values. But in Tibet, both at school and at home, harsh laws and regulations restrict discussion of Tibet's history, limit manifestations of Tibetan traditions, and punish expressions of Tibetan religious beliefs, creating an atmosphere of pervasive hostility to the Tibetan cultural identity. Primary schools in Tibet, far from permitting each Tibetan child to enjoy his or her own culture, to profess and practice his or her own religion, and to use his or her own language, accelerate the atrophy of Tibetan children's cultural identity. Yeah, we will read the last in the last video, the next video. Thank you.